Well, look, I'd like to thank you all for coming. Tonight it's not an esoteric subject, it's something which is close to our hearts because the world is changing and the same dilemma which faced Australia during World War I faces Australia today. Now, I think before I look at the anti-war movement during World War I in this country and how significant it was, I want to look at what life was like in Australia for most people. The first thing is we only had a population of around 5 million Europeans and about 90,000 Aboriginals were there. Now, this is at the time of Federation, and people believed at that time that all you could do for the Indigenous people was to smooth the pillow of a dying race. That was the philosophy at that particular point in time. And most Aboriginal people living north of the Brisbane line and in the most deplorable conditions. Now, as far as the country was concerned, you've got to remember that Federation occurred in 1901, and the first piece of legislation which went through Parliament, legislated the House of Assembly, was the White Australia policy, and only one member of Parliament voted against the White Australia policy. So by 1914, the implementation of the White Australia policy and the implementation of the second piece of legislation, which was the Canuck Deportation Act, meant that most people living in Australia at that particular point in time were British descendants or Irish descendants. That's the great bulk of the population. Now that's an interesting division. English or Scottish, people from the United Kingdom and people from Ireland, which you've got to remember that at that particular point in time, Ireland was a British colony and actually achieved independence. Now, during those first 14 to 15 years of Federation, life was very hard for most working people and most of the small farmers which had land on the east coast and a little bit on the west coast. So life was very predictable. Wages were low. Although the Parliament, when the first Labor Party came into power, passed legislation to give unionists preference of employment, the fact was that wages were low, conditions were terrible, people didn't travel overseas, there was no travelling, there was not even much travelling in between the states, people were very isolated, there was no television, there were no telephones, so people relied on what was basically in the newspapers at the time. So it was quite a cohesive society, but a very poor society, especially in the regional and rural areas because of the drought, profound drought which occurred at the time of Federation, which lasted over 5 years. So that's the scene. So when war was declared on the 1st of August 1914, it was party time. And all you've got to do is look at the flocks of young men who descended on the recruitment centres to be inducted into the Australian Armed Forces, because everybody thought war was a bit of a lark. It would all be over in 4 to 5 weeks. It was a great way to go to Europe and have a good time, and it was a great way to escape the misery and drudgery of everyday life, whether you're in a factory or whether you were working on the land, because it was quite a difficult lifestyle. And remember, so that's the society you have, and most people lived in the major cities also. So this is the type of society that occurred. Now, war was declared on the 1st of August 1914 as a consequence, and this is interesting when you look at 2026, of a series of alliances which occurred in Europe. both Eastern and Western Europe. And most of these alliances were based on, how shall I put it, royal, I don't like using the word, royal families. And most of the thing that Queen Victoria did is she produced a lot of kids, I think 9, and a lot of daughters. And the daughters were sent out to marry different kings, like in Germany, in Russia. So there's this kind of alliance, that they all know each other. They're all part of the ruling classes. The struggle for changes and reform had ground to a halt across Europe to a major degree. So when a Serbian nationalist assassinated the Archduke of Ferdinand, there were all these different treaties which came into play. So you saw the Ottoman Turks form an alliance with the Germans and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was huge at that particular point in time. At the same time, what you had the Western forces, which were to a significant degree apart from France, interrelated because of the marriages that occurred over between the royals over the last 70 to 80 years. So when war started, as I said, and all you've got to do, you can see these pictures, and there are not only just pictures, but there's also movies, documentaries. And I've seen one at Melbourne Town Hall when it was opened up for people to volunteer, and there were lines of young men which went for hundreds of metres, because everybody thought this is a way to get out of the drudgery of everyday life. And obviously a lot of married men felt this is a good way to escape the domestic responsibilities. Right? So there was this kind of atmosphere of frivolity. It was a little bit like when Tanaminuwa and Mormohina were executed in 1842, there was a carnival atmosphere. It was something different. So the Prime Minister, who was a Labor Prime Minister, said that we will fight this war for the British Empire to the last man and the last shilling, and everybody celebrated. Every single major organisation in this country supported Australia's entry into World War I. Now, you've got 5 million people living on a continent. There were 1 million men who are of military age. That's in between 16 and 40. 1 million. Within 12 months, over 420,000 volunteered. 420,000 out of a population of 5 million and a population of, 1 million men that could volunteer. And these people got about 8 weeks training, was given a rough uniform, and for them, many of them, this was the first wage they had received in their life. They didn't have to worry about being unemployed, they didn't have to worry about the crops not producing enough to make a profit, so they were receiving a wage. And it was just like a boy's own annual. So they were packed into ships and sent off to what can be described as the European killing fields. Now the difference between World War I and World War II and what we see today, where civilians are the major casualties, World War I was an old-fashioned war which was fought by armies. So the Australians' first conflict was centred around the Dardanelles. And the British had the idea that they would attack the Ottoman Turks at the Dardanelles as a diversionary way of getting the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Germans to deploy a large number of people there. They forgot that the Turks actually existed and that they were reasonably well done. So when they arrived at the Dardanelles, this is when on the 15th of April 1915, we saw the first major casualties of Australian soldiers. And we saw the death of over 8,000 Australian soldiers just on the Dardanelles, just during the Anzac campaign. And we're talking about hand-to-hand fighting, bayonet fight, people fighting with bayonets, about atrocities, just extraordinary things. Because what people have forgotten is that the nature of warfare had changed because of industrialisation. And all you had to do is look at the American Civil War 50 years earlier, 50 to 60 years earlier, to see the huge number of casualties because of the industrialisation of warfare, where you had cannons, Gatling guns, guns that, repeated. There were over 1 million deaths during the American Civil War, but nobody had been taught that lesson. So you had troops riding into battle on horses, facing tanks and machine guns. You had troops that would jump over the parapets to capture, 10 metres of land with a machine gun in front of them. And the fact is that human life at that particular point in that war was irrelevant to the officers who were responsible for the majority of the campaign. So this frivolous, happy, almost festival-like atmosphere changed almost within a few weeks as the body count rose. In those days, they didn't telephone you. What would happen is you would get a telegram that your son or your uncle or your father was either dead or was missing in action. So what we saw was, in a population of 5 million, we saw, as the body count increased, the ability to recruit the 600,000 men who were eligible to be recruited to volunteer dissipate. For example, there was a big meeting at Dandenong Town Hall. They used to have recruitment meetings, and 5,000 people turned up and not one person volunteered. Because by that time people began to understand this is a war which has profound implications. Because you've got to remember, the families of these men who were killed were not compensated. There were no pensions at that particular point in time. So you've got these families that suddenly find their major breadwinner has disappeared and they're slipping into poverty. Now, at the same time, war profiteering became the name of the game. In all wars, making a buck for a minority is important. We saw increasing inflation. We saw that wages were pegged. The War Precautions Act was introduced, and the War Precautions Act meant that unionists had lost first preference choice in terms of job. They were no longer preference. So we saw scabs being employed, throwing out unionists. So we're getting a little bit of friction. Now, the only organisation that initially was against World War I were the industrial workers of the world, who I spoke about in the past. The industrial workers of the world were formed initially in 1908 in Adelaide, and they were divided into what was called the De Leon faction, which was a faction which was made up of socialists, which was interested in political action, and you had a direct action faction called the Chicago branch. And in 1911, what we saw was that the Chicago faction gave a permission for some Adelaide activists, there were about 8 of them, to form a branch of the industrial workers of the world. And within 12 months, a branch had been formed in Sydney. So when war broke out, there was this hysteria regarding supporting the war. The hysteria was to such a degree that the government issued war bonds, and you got a higher rate of interest if you invested in a war bond than you normally would get. And the advertisement is, invest in a war bond, no risk, and you get a higher rate of interest, all right? So, if you look at that picture I've shown you, that you've got there at the front, that's right. If you look at that picture, what you can see is the beginning of resistance to the idea that people should volunteer at that particular point in time. And that resistance was spearheaded initially by the Sydney branch of the industrial workers of the world. They're at the forefront of that particular struggle. So when war broke out on the 1st of August, they were the first people that said, this is ludicrous. This is a dirty little trade war which has been fought by workers at either end of the bayonet. They had a class analysis of what this war was about. It was about workers fighting each other at either end of the bayonet for the glory of God, King and country. And if you look at the monuments, and I encourage you to look at all the monuments around this country for World War I, it's not about freedom, it's not about liberty, it's not about defending the country, it's about God, King and country. And that's what people sacrifice, that's what people joined to protect their British heritage, the fact they were Christians, etc., etc. So we've got this situation where the body count is increasing. The Australian troops are now sent to the Palestine and Egypt, basically to recuperate before they're sent into Europe. Now, politically, things were changing. The Labor Party was in power on the 1st of August. Now, Billy Hughes became Prime Minister a few months later. Now, Billy Hughes was interestingly, the first Secretary of the Waterside Workers Federation, but he was never a waterside worker. And he became Prime Minister. Now, Hughes and about a third of the Labor Party were all for the war, 100%. But the trade union movement was split about 70% against, 30% for the war. And at that particular time, the nexus, the interrelationship between the trade union movement and the Australian Labor Party was very strong, because the Australian Labor Party had been created as a result of a failed series of strikes down the east coast of Australia, the shearers' strike in the 1890s, and many of the miners' strikes at Broken Hill, etc., etc. So there was a strong association. Now, Billy Hughes went to Europe in January 1916 to be part of the Imperial War Cabinet. Right? He didn't return till June 1916, because in those days you'd take a nice little boat trip, first class as Prime Minister, and why would you want to return to little old Australia? But he was pressured by the British government to introduce conscription, because things were going badly on the Western Front. He was pressured to introduce conscription, and the British government introduced conscription in June 1916, right? They introduced that conscription at that particular point in time. So what happened was that when he came back to Australia, he had lost his grip on the Australian Labor Party, because he was a proponent of introducing conscription into the country. So what he did is they had a discussion in Cabinet, and they made a decision to hold a plebiscite. Not a referendum, but a plebiscite, as we saw with gay marriage, right? It was a plebiscite. And he said that if he expected that the plebiscite would be passed, the conscription would become part of the Australian Armed Forces. And a letter was sent out for 600,000 men, not an email or an SMS, but a letter, the 600,000 men who had enlisted, asking them when they were going to enlist. If they weren't going to enlist, why weren't they going to enlist? So basically they were creating roles of people that they were going to call up as soon as the plebiscite was successful. What happened by then is an interesting coalition occurred. And a coalition occurred between four disparate groups, basically. The trade union movement, or 2/3 of the trade union movement, which was concerned about inflation and war profiteering, pegged wages, problems, there were food riots in Sydney. So there was segments of the trade union movement which were calling for a general strike to oppose any conscription. At the same time, we saw the failed Easter uprising in Ireland. And what that meant is, what we saw is a number of the more prominent members of the Easter Rebellion were executed by the British. Although the Easter Rebellion wasn't something that had been properly planned and failed very quickly, but the British wanted to teach the Irish a lesson. At that particular point in time, there was a significant Irish population in Australia, and we had the irascible Archbishop Mannix here in Melbourne. Now, Archbishop Mannix hated the British with a passion because of what they'd done with the execution of the people involved, the leaders involved in the Easter Rebellion in 1916. So what happened is, from the pulpit, as we saw during the Vietnam War when they argued for the war, the Roman Catholic Church was mobilised to oppose the war. So we've got the industrial workers of the world accidentally joining forces with the Roman Catholic Church to oppose the introduction of conscription into the country. So Mr. Prime Minister, Billy Hughes, decided to hold a plebiscite, as I said before, which would be held on the 28th of October 1916. And as you know, in a plebiscite, as a referendum, you need a majority of voters in a majority of states to support the proposition. And the proposition was to introduce conscription, right? So, at the same time, mothers in Australia were beginning a little bit concerned about their sons being sacrificed on the European killing fields. Because in some families, we had 3 or 4 sons, or husbands and sons, whole families that volunteered. If any of you ever go to King Island, I suggest you look at the honour board of all the men that volunteered to fight in World War I, and you'll be astounded by the number of men who volunteered just from King Island. So there was a huge... So the women's movement, which had started to become more vocal, especially in Melbourne, the women's movement began to oppose what was called the War Precautions Act, which prevented people from even singing anti-war songs or actually making any statements against conscription. They began to physically oppose it. And Vida Goldstein, who I've spoken about before, formed, with a number of other women, the Women's Peace Army. And the Women's Peace Army's aim was to wage war against war. And they were exceptionally successful. And on the 3rd of September, when Melbourne's population was about 700,000, they had a mass demonstration on the Yarra Bank, which was only addressed by women speakers because the Women's Peace Army had organised it, and over 100,000 people. That's equivalent to saying 1 million people turn up at a Palestinian rally. So over 100,000 people gathered at the Yarra Bank to hear this bevy of women speakers fight against the war. So you've got the Roman Catholic Church under Archbishop Mannix in Melbourne. You've got the Women's Peace Movement all over Australia, but especially in Melbourne. The Women's Peace Army. And you've got the rank outsiders, the industrial workers of the world. Now, Hughes knew that there was a great deal of resistance in the trade union movement to conscription, and there was the possibility of a general strike occurring. And he was very concerned about a general strike and the effect that would have on the war effort, and more importantly, his reputation in Britain, in the British Imperial Cabinet, whatever they used to call it. So, what do you do in a situation where you're going to hold a plebiscite? You've got these nice people opposing you, the Women's Peace Army, the Roman Catholic Church under Archbishop Mannix, nice socialists. So you focus on the industrial workers of the world because they're the bête noirs, right? Now, the industrial workers of the world had never experienced such an increase in membership, especially the Sydney branch, and their monthly journal, which was called Direct Action. Don't believe the Trots have the same Direct Action. Became a weekly. Their membership grew in late 1912 from 12 people to hundreds, if not thousands. And they were involved in anti-war activity. And they were basically the muscle. They were the direct actions. They were the muscle behind that. Now, they attacked the war, or anti-war, but also anti-conscription. And they attacked it directly, not politically, through action, but attacked it directly. So what we saw was the government turned its attention to the industrial workers of the world, claiming they were pro-German. They were pro-German, and they wanted you to vote no, because they were financed by the Germans, and they were pro-Germans, and they were murderers and arsonists, and you couldn't trust a word they say. Because the plebiscite was the first plebiscite was on the 28th of October 1916. So what happened? Well, the first thing that happened is Tom Barker, who was a prominent member of the industrial workers of the world, he was from Britain. He was an industrial workers of the world activist. He went to New Zealand, where he was under charges for being involved in organising strikes. Then he jumped ship in Australia and joined the industrial workers of Sydney branch. Right? He became the editor of Direct Action. And Sid Nichols, do you know the name Sid Nichols? You should, in the Australian Patriots. No? You ever heard of the cartoon character Ginger Meggs? Well, Sid Nichols was the cartoonist who later on created the Ginger Meggs series, which was an Australian cartoon series. Well, his first job was with Direct Action, and this was his first cartoon that showing. Now, obviously, the authorities didn't want these type of posters appearing on walls. So every time they were put up, they were pulled down. And legislation was introduced under the War Precautions Act, which prevented anybody from being involved in active anti-conscription activity. Now, there was a second poster which is more famous than this, which I haven't been able to access. But I know the caption, and it's a brilliant caption. I think it's the best poster, anti-war poster you've ever seen. And it caused consternation. Because you've got to remember, it's ordinary people that volunteered. It wasn't the sons of the rich and powerful. And this poster said, "To arms, politicians, capitalists, landlords, parsons, newspaper editors. Your country needs you in the trenches. Workers, follow your masters." To expose the hypocrisy. I'll go for it again. I think it's just a brilliant thing. To arms, politicians, parsons, capitalists, newspaper editors, and other landlords, and other patriots, and other stay-at-home patriots, and other stay-at-home patriots. Your country needs you in the trenches. Workers, follow your masters. All right?
It's in the book Sydney is Burning.
Yeah. So that poster earned Tom Barker, who was editor of Direct Action, 12 months jail sentence. And then he was deported back to England after the war. And he had an illustrious history as an activist and became a member, not a member, a mayor of one of the London boroughs in the 1960s. So, big supporter of public housing. So, at the same time, you had a number of mysterious fires which occurred across Sydney. Now, if you look at Ian Turner's book, Sydney's Burning, it looks at these fires. And on the 3rd of October, 3.5 weeks before the plebiscite, 12 members of the Industrial Workers of the World were arrested and charged with treason, arson, conspiracy. Now, their cases didn't come up for trial till the 17th of November. At the same time, the Tottenham branch of the Industrial Workers of the World was having a lot of trouble with the constable there, George Duncan. And for some reason, they got into their heads that the best way to deal with the situation was to kill him. And they shot him dead. And this was, again, 3 weeks before the plebiscite. There was Ronald Kennedy, his brother Roland Kennedy, his brother Herb Kennedy, and a bloke unfortunately called Frank Franz. Very Germanic, everybody thought, Fritz and Franz. Now, they came to trial. Roland, who was only 20, and Franz were found guilty and were hung within 6 weeks in Goulburn jail. And I did a bit of research on them in the past, and you can still see their grave sites outside Goulburn jail. But the brother, who was also involved in the murder, was acquitted 2 days later. Who knows what? So you've got all this hysteria. Things are burning. Shops are burning. It's a little bit like the tobacco wars here. Shops are burning. You've got 12 members of the IWW charged with treason, conspiracy and murder. And I'll pass around their photos and I'll read out their names because I think they should be remembered. You had Morris Joseph Fagan, William Teene, Thomas Glynn, Donald McPherson, William Beattie, Bob Besant, John Hamilton, Peter Larkin, Donald Grant, John Benjamin King, Thomas Moore and Charles Reed. I'll pass it around to you. Just ordinary working folk who were members of the Industrial Workers of the World. The Industrial Workers of the World wanted to form one big union, which was not based on trade qualifications, but on a work site, and they felt that the best way to achieve revolution is by democratising the workplace.
Were there any women?
I'll talk about that in a minute. There were women, but they weren't arrested. They were jailed later on. Right. So you've got the trial coming up. You've got the Tottenham 3, which have been, accused of murdering Constable George Duncan. And there's nothing to say they didn't murder him. And their trial, if you look at the transcript of this trial is available, it's all about their membership of the Industrial Workers of the World. It's got very little to do with the murder of the constable. So we have the plebiscite on the 28th of October. Now, obviously, the Mirror and the other gutter press, the yellow press, is having a field day. And the headline before the plebiscite was, the IWW and Germany wants you to vote no. The government wants you to vote yes. Now, everybody, including Billy Hughes, believed that the plebiscite would be successful. But they forgot this grand coalition of Roman Catholic riffraff, Women's Peace Army, sirens, and the scoundrels from the Industrial Workers of the World, and the trade and section of the trade union movement had a profound impact on the vote. And guess what? The plebiscite failed. Now, Billy Hughes was always an astute political operative, realised that his number was up. So the day after the plebiscite had failed, he called a cabinet meeting and not a cabinet, sorry, a caucus meeting, and 23 of the 65 members crossed the floor with Billy Hughes. They formed the National Labor Party. They joined the opposition nationalists in the Pro War and had a majority in Parliament, and Billy Hughes continued to be Prime Minister of Australia. So what had happened is that obviously, like we saw with the split, the Labor Party had shot itself in the head. Most people believe that it would never recover. Now, at the same time, people began to realise that the IWW-12 had basically been framed by the state, by both the New South Wales government and the Australian government. Now, they'd been jailed from periods of 5 to 15 years. And a movement sprung up during the war to free these men from prison because it was just obvious. And there were a number of inquiries which I'll go into. Now, at the same time, the War Proportions Act was extended, as we saw after the bombing of the Twin Towers. When within a few days we saw legislation passed through Parliament which removed a lot of rights that people have. So the War Precautions Act, as we have now, we've got the same acts, and they've been, updated in the last 12 months. The IWW was banned, its newspaper was seized, its printing presses were destroyed, any assets they had, which they had very few assets, were seized, and more importantly, any member of the IWW who refused to renounce their membership of the organisation or who was a known member of the organisation was to be jailed for 6 months with hard labour. This is when the women were involved. There was a number of women involved in industrial workers of the world, and there were a number of women involved in industrial workers of the world, and they've been organising mass meetings of 2, 3, 5, 10,000 people in their anti-war campaign, conscription campaign, were jailed with hard labour. At the same time, this is how ludicrous it was, Monty Miller, the famous Monty Miller, who'd been at the Eureka Rebellion in 1854 as a 13-year-old, who jumped the fence and assisted those who were dying, who was an activist and trade unionist, who was well known around the country, was 86, and he was jailed for 6 months with hard labour. So basically, the government was able, by the end of 1916, early 1917, was able to destroy the industrial workers of the world, but they weren't able to destroy the anti-conscription movement because it had become much wider. Because everybody who had a father or an uncle or a brother out on the Western Front was horrified by the stories which are coming back of the mass slaughter. 8,000 Australians died in one day in one battle on the Western Front in the Somme. 62,000 Australian young men died fighting this dirty trade war for the glory of God, King and country. Another 60,000 died of their war wounds within 10 years of returning to the country. Now, Australian soldiers had a reputation for being not, to some degree, obeying orders and going on leave without absence without leave. And at that time, the British Army was executing people for desertion if they went. Now, to the credit of Monash and the other Australian generals, they refused to introduce executions for desertion in the Australian Army because they knew this was a volunteer force, and if they started shooting people, everybody would desert. Everybody would go home. Although the British Army had introduced executions for desertion, and hundreds, if not thousands, of men were executed. Thousands in the British Army executed in the British Army for desertion. But the Australian Armed Forces said refused to introduce execution for desertion because these were all volunteers. Now, Billy Hughes felt that realised that the tide of war was turning. So what Billy Hughes did is, as you do, he called a second referendum for December 1917. And he went on a whistle tour, train whistle tour, not plane, train, of Australia, the East Coast, to spread the conscription message. Now remember, the first plebiscite was lost by over 68,000 votes, right? So this is another one 12 or 14 months later. Now, at that particular time, Queensland, believe it or not, was the radical element. It was the radical state. It was the radical state because Queensland was one to be centralised, but it was actually many of the people who lived there were what do you call it? They were workers who didn't have permanent employment. They were like shearers, well, they weren't indentured, but they were
Casual.
well, they're part-time. They depended on the agriculture. The mechanics were indentured labourers. Seasonal workers, yeah. So there were a lot of, because in those days, because there wasn't much machinery, you relied on labour. So at that particular point in time, or later on, we saw the election of a communist to the federal part, but that's a different story. But what I'm saying, Fred Patterson, beaten almost to a pulp by the cops. That's a different story. So we've got him doing this whistle tour, and he turns up at Warwick in Queensland. Anybody been to Warwick? And the tradition was you'd get out of the train, there'd be people waiting, you'd give your speech, and then you'd turn off to the next railway station. Obviously, he had his nice little carriage there. And he gave his speech, and while he was giving his speech, somebody threw an egg at him, which hit him on the head. So he went up to the police constable on the platform, or one of his minions, and said, "Can you arrest that man?" And the copper said, "No." And he said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, I'm a state officer. I'm only responsible to Red Ted Theodore, who was the premier of Queensland at that particular point in time." Now this really affronted poor old Billy. And when he went back to, Melbourne, there wasn't no Canberra then, where Parliament was, they passed legislation which created the federal police. So I've always said the federal police badge should be a rotten egg with a copper standing in the middle, because that was their beginning, all right? Now, hatched. Second plebiscite, right? Fails by 178,000 votes. May not sound a lot, but remember there's only about 1.5 million people that can vote, right? So it fails. Now, good old Billy, and I've got to give him credit for being a political manipulator, he said to the electorate, if this plebiscite doesn't pass, I will resign as Prime Minister. And he did, for a day. And he went to the Governor-General and asked him to reappoint him as the Prime Minister. And he was reappointed. Boom, boom. But the tragedy was, this is a huge tragedy for the nation. You have 420,000 young men volunteering. As I said before, 62,000 died in Europe. Their bodies were never returned home. Some of their bodies were never found. So the families had no idea what had happened to their loved ones. Another 60,000 came with significant injuries because gas was being used on the Western Front. And they died of their war wounds. And many others had psychological issues. Now, I don't know if any of you remember Elma Morton.
Yeah.
Well, Elma Morton, I did an obituary for her in the age when she died. And because we used to do a radio program next to each other, we used to rubbish each other as friends, not enemies. And Elma, in her history, when she was talking to me about her life, when she was a little girl, her father was a returned serviceman. And at about 2 o'clock in the morning, several times a week, he would grab a rifle, herd his wife and children into the lounge, sit on a chair outside the lounge and say, "The Huns are coming, the Huns are coming." Right? So there were many men around the country who were devastated by what they'd seen and what had happened to them. Because this was disgusting warfare. This wasn't, you send a missile or a drone and everything is collateral damage, you don't worry. This was people actually looking at somebody in the eye and trying to bayonet them. This is people being sent over the parapet to capture a machine gun nest when you know that half of those men are going to be machine gunned to death. This is when human life, as far as the generals were concerned and the government was concerned, was irrelevant. So it had a profound impact. Now, interestingly, when the returned servicemen returned, they split into two factions. Those that were against war and those that were quite conservative, who formed the nucleus of the New Guard, which was basically a secret underground organisation which was going to take over Australia if the Commos, got any power. And if you look at the history in this country in the 20s and 30s, you can see that. But at the same time, in many regards, it was a blessing for people who were on the progressive agenda, because many of those who'd supported the God, King and Country idea had been killed. And much of the trade union activity which occurred after World War I was a direct result of the fact that there were fewer men who were willing to, believe in the God, King and Country concept. So my beef is this, and I've got a beef, and I've had a beef for many years. My beef is this: I can go to any town, any suburb, and I can see a war memorial. I can read the names of that war memorial. I can see it's about God, King and Country, and I understand that. I've got no problems about that. But nowhere in this country's history are there monuments, except inside Trades Hall in Victoria Street, inside Trades Hall, where there is a low-key monument when you enter through the Lygon Street entrance, which we'll look at on the 1st of May. There is no... When you hear people talk about Anzac and Anzac Day, we never hear about the anti-conscription movement and the people who were sacrificed because they were involved in that movement, who saved the lives of at least another 100,000 young Australian men. Because if they had been conscripted, they would have been sent to the European killing fields on the Western Front and would have been slaughtered, like animals. You don't hear it on Anzac Day. You don't hear it anywhere, how important the anti-conscription movement was. Now, I acknowledge that World War I is entirely different to World War II, because World War I was not about the defence of Australia. It wasn't about protecting the parliamentary democracy. It wasn't about liberty or freedom. It was about God, King and Country, and nobody can deny that. All you've got to do is look at the propaganda at that particular point in time. World War II was different. It was a war against fascism. It was a war against the defence of Australia. And I remember when Paul Keating was Prime Minister, what he tried to do was change the focus from World War I to the Dakota Trail and the importance of the resistance in the Dakota Trail. Because that was an important period in Australian history. Because even then, it was all about the British Empire. And all our battle-hardened troops had been sent to North Africa to fight with the British. And when the Japanese came down and took over Singapore, and went through Malaysia and Singapore, and started bombing Darwin and Broome, and North Australia, what we relied on was young boys between 18 and 20 who'd been conscripted with 8 weeks training who were sent to the Dakota Trail to prevent the Japanese. Now, the old hands who'd been called back by the Curtin Labor government, who were called back to Australia used to make fun of these young blokes. They used to call them chocos. They would melt in the sun. That weeks they'd have any training, they would melt in the sun, but they showed it. So what I'm saying is, if you're going to remember the dead, and I think it's important we remember the dead, if you're going to do that, base it on factual evidence. Don't base it on myths. Because I can assure you, if you speak to 98% of Australians, they will tell you that World War I was about freedom and democracy. And if you listen to the speeches on the 25th of April, they are the speeches, because the story is that Australia became a nation when Australian blood soaked into the sands of the Dardanelles and the Western Front. What a load of crap. What a load of total crap. So this is nothing new in Australian history. That's why I'm doing this series, because there's been a lot of pivotal moments in Australian history which have been brushed aside. They're not acknowledged, and if we don't acknowledge them, nobody will acknowledge them. And remember that Sudanese reporter 3 years ago, I met her in London when I was there, I went and saw her, forgotten her name. She made a comment about Anzac Day, and she was driven out of this country. Driven out of this country, and now she lives in London because she can't, make a living here. So anybody apart from non-entities like us who raise these issues find themselves automatically on the outer, although the reality and the facts and the history tell a different story. Now, I do know that people are now talking about the frontier wars. There's a lot of literature regarding the frontier wars, and there's a pushback regarding colonisation. But there is no pushback regarding the way Anzac Day is being used to militarise the country, to prepare us for war. And that's what concerns me, is that they are using the deaths of these men, and many of them are anti-war, to promote the idea of us having to be involved in constant warfare. And it's propaganda at its best. So we do what we can when we can, but the fact is that this country has a proud history of being anti-war. We've seen ordinary people, despite governments, rise up and defeat two plebiscites to introduce conscription in this country. And we've got a lot to be proud of. Unfortunately, everybody remembers Billy Hughes because he remained Prime Minister for many years. But nobody remembers the IWW-12, nobody remembers the Kennedys, nobody remembers, they do remember Vida Goldstein, but they remember her as a female suffragette and activist, not as an anti-war activist. Not only did the Peace Army set up these demonstrations, they set up a food hall at RMIT. What's the theatre? Story Hall. They hired Story Hall and they set up a food distribution centre for people who'd been afflicted by extreme poverty during World War I because of inflation and because their breadwinners had died in the war and no provision was made for the widows until after the war, when provisions were made in terms of payments. So all I can say is, I reckon maybe we should put this in our Australian values test for new immigrants. I think it'll be a good one. Questions?
What's the key lesson from that?
Well, the key lesson today is we've seen the same things. The legislation, repressive legislation, it may not have been implemented at this particular point in time, but it is there. And when people see repressive legislation being applied against Nazis, they forget that that repressive legislation can be applied against us. When you see the Queensland government passing legislation which makes it a criminal offence, say from, river to the sea, or the globalisation of the intifada, you know you've got a problem. When you see divided nations rising and rising because they believe this shit, you know, you know we've got a problem. So the problem is the fact that if you don't remember your history, you don't learn from your history, and you repeat the same mistakes over and over and over again. Now, see, this little group, we could be defined as a potential threat to Commonwealth interests in this country, and the Attorney General can ban us, bang. Now, in World War One, they got 6 months jail and hard labour. Today, you can be jailed for up to 25 years for being a member of a proscribed organisation. You can be jailed for up to 25 years for raising money for a prescribed organisation. I'll give you an example. Now, I did a series of interviews about 4 years ago with the autonomous regions of northeast Syria. Now, they've been designated, God only knows, a terrorist organisation. Now, there was somebody who was going to do an arms sale to raise money for medical equipment. They were approached by Asia and told that if they didn't cancel the thing, they would be charged and be part of the because they were assisting a prescribed organisation. It's like Hezbollah, Hamas.
I know I was sending money to Palestine, and a friend of mine who was very much involved, he said, be careful where you send the money because you could be accused of
That's right.
yeah. So I sent it to a hospital.
Because the laws are draconian. All right, you look like, you're going overseas, aren't you? You look like a terrorist type to me. You could be scooped off the street legally.
Where?
In Australia, held in detention for 7 days, questioned. If you refuse to answer questions, you could be charged in jail for up to 5 years. And after they had their little ways with you, if they decide you're just a little old granny going back to see the family in England, they can throw you out on the street. And you can't tell anybody that you've been detained for 7 days and questioned by the authorities. Otherwise, you get jailed. Remember the doctor a few years ago? About 10 years ago, the doctor, I've forgotten his name, he was an Indian doctor. They thought he was a terrorist or a supervisor, and he was automatically detained and jailed. Now look at these idiots, little kids, I call them, disturbed kids who go on the net and, make these outlandish claims. Look at the sentences which have been handed out to them. Just extraordinary. It really is.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary. And it's all legal. And both sides, both the major parties supported the legislation. And they continue to support the legislation. And it's all been... So that's the lesson. The lesson is that what happened in the past can happen at any time if the government of the day believes their friend. I'll give you an example. This talk I'm doing on the 25th of April for the Italian community. I'm looking at the Italian anti-fascist resistance in Australia during the war, right? Now,
I thought it was a Greek.
it's a Greek class.
Oh.
We don't mind Greeks. It's all right. They're almost our brothers and sisters. Although I'm Sicilian, I don't like Greeks or Italians. That's a different story. No, I'm just joking. But it's on tape. But where was I? Yeah. Oh, I forgot where I was.
The talk.
The talk. What happened is that we saw these draconian laws introduced in the 20s, which make it an offence to advocate for the abolition of government because of the anarchist presence in Australia between the governments, between the wars. So you've got all these horrible pieces of legislation which are there. You've got, see, people forget, and I speak about this all the time, you've got no right to strike in this country, that's been legislated away. You've got no right to freedom of assembly. You've got no right to freedom of speech, unless there's an implied right in the Constitution. Because when the Constitution was formulated between 1890 and 1901, when they had 6 separate referendums, or 5, the West Australia came in later on, referendum which supported the changes, there was a huge debate in the 1890s whether they should introduce rights, individual rights within the Australian Constitution, and that faction lost. So the Australian Constitution is not based on individual rights, it's based on the relationship between the states and the central government. So we've got less rights in Australia than any other Western liberal parliamentary system, even less than England, which doesn't even have a written constitution.
And we saw it in Queensland that student arrested and
Yeah,
that slogan on a t-shirt.
that's right. That's right. Well, new legislation has been passed regarding environmental activists, and we're seeing them jailed, quiet periods, and it's just extraordinary.
Well, there are things now that if we did now, there's things that we did in the 80s.
They're in jail.
We'd be locked up for money.
Thank you,
And
Barbara. for
they
coming.
were just honest protests.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. You can be jailed for if you articulate certain ideas. You can be jailed.
One of the key differences now is that back then you had opposition groups.
Yeah.
You had the, what was it?
You had the union.
The Wobblies, you had
The
Catholic
union.
Church.
That's right, the union.
You had the women's movement.
Yeah.
But now we're so fractured.
We're totally fractured. It's all about identity politics. I'm sorry to say.
Yeah.
It's all about identity.
Yeah.
I was at 3CR today and almost cried, but that's a different story. I mean, identity politics rules the roost, and it makes no allowances for real struggle.
People can get locked up for saying a political slogan or whatever, like to become a militant.
Yeah.
But why is it that our liberal leader, I can't even remember his name.
We call him the loser, that's what I call him.
Yeah,
It's Angus Taylor, but I call him the loser.
But he needs, when he first bumped Susan May out the way, the first thing he said, more or less, was, we've got too many migrants coming to this country. There was no substantiation, there was no data, there was no nothing. And he got away. No one challenged him on it. It didn't say, well, can you tell us what those are?
It's worthless.
Yeah, this is Paul's favourite thing, and he's quite 100% right. It's the organisations which existed in the past which could come together to resist government no longer exist. The trade union movement is it's 12%, and most of them are public servants. The progressive movement is on life support. Nobody's interested in what we have to say. Nobody's interested in, redistributing income. Nobody's interested in looking at the why we find ourselves in this situation. We do our best, but the interest is almost minuscule.
Well, I have a comrade, Tony Drewbury, who many years ago, he joined a particular group, and I said, oh, Tony, why are you doing that? And he said these words to me, and I've never forgotten them. He said, I have a duty to keep, the words don't come now, but to keep resistance alive. And I just thought, yeah, okay, we do what we can, because the situation may change.
Well, it may change overnight. For example, divided nation. 6 months ago, it was dead.
Yeah.
6 months later,
Gina.
radical, big changes. Not just in Gina, forget about Gina, in the public mind. They think that this is the new Messiah, that they're going to assist them to deal with all their problems.
Like Trump, like Farage.
Yeah. But the same thing could happen to us in 6 months' time, when these organisations, as we saw in Hungary for Obama, when these organisations are found to be fake prophets. That's a new word, fake prophets. Or fake messiahs, even better problem. Fake messiahs. Because they are fake messiahs. They promise everything, but they don't look at the economic issues. Not at all. It's all about peripheral issues, what you look like, what you wear, what's your religion.
I guess it's a matter of collecting the embers.
Family members.
Family members.
Well, it's like this. What we have? What, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 people here, including me. If I didn't talk about this today,
Yeah.
very few people would bring it up on Anzac Day or around this period. If I didn't do the video and put it up, and I might get 50 views if I'm lucky, well, at least that's 50 people who are more aware of the history. And what I'm talking about, I can verify.
Yeah.
These are facts. These aren't belief systems. Everybody works on belief systems today. It's not a feeling. These are facts which you can actually find if you look for them.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know what I'll speak about next month, but we'll speak about British immigrators who leave the country.
Oh yes, I could watch it on YouTube.
Don't wait.
It's good, it's good.
Get some radical English history. The Levellers. Learn about, you know about the Levellers?
Yeah.
Oh, there you go. The Levellers, that's what you like.
And the swingers.
The Swingers, yeah.
And,
Well, I've spoke about the Swingers.
Yeah, that was the first one I came to.
Yeah.
Sorry, Joe, did you have to turn it on?
If you've got a question,
No, it's just like that it was between the constitution between the states and
the central government, that's the federal
central
government. Yeah, because if you look at the Australian Constitution, I keep it under my pillow and I read it every night. It's bullshit.
That's why you go to sleep.
Exactly. See, I bore myself to sleep. If you look at it, there is nothing. As I keep saying, there are four rights in the Constitution. You have 4 rights in Australia as an individual. 4? No, you have 4. You have potentially freedom of religion, but that's questionable considering how people are talking about Muslims. Freedom of religion. You can. You've got. You should be paid fair compensation if the state acquires your property. And interestingly, the people involved in the Wick decision sued the federal government because they'd been denied their sea rights through legislation. And because that was a right, the High Court found it was a right, they will have to be compensated. So there, you've got that for it. And the right to trial by jury for a major crime. And the most important right you have, not that I expect somebody like you to understand because you're from Britain and you don't have states, is the fact that I cannot discriminate against somebody from another state in legislation. And that was interesting when Clive Palmer wanted to do a High Court case to break down the COVID restrictions. He had a very good chance of winning if he could get it to the High Court.
Wow.
Because you cannot discriminate against a group of people because they're from New South Wales or Victoria. And that was important to get the federation because they wouldn't have agreed to federation if they could pass legislation which could discriminate against another state. I've got one trick question before I finish. Paul will know the answer. You know that people were concerned about First Nations people not being included in the preamble to the Australian Constitution. There is one very important omission, apart from First Nations people. West Australians. The West Australians never joined until after the other 5 states had federated. So if you look at the preamble, there's no mention of West Australia. We should have a referendum about that, and we'll make sure they never get. It's hilarious. It really is.
Yes, they. Oh, man.
But it's hilarious. You read the preamble, none of them are not mentioned, they don't exist.
Yeah.
I mean, they're so funny. I think it was in 1932 or 33 they passed, they did a local referendum to secede from the country. And under the Constitution, you can't secede unless the other states agree. So they The other states didn't agree. So they took a case to the Privy Council, and the Privy Council found that the British Parliament had passed legislation 12 months previously that it couldn't intervene in the affairs of countries that had achieved independence from the British Empire. So they're two-time losers. But they're getting their back for the GST now. They're getting there.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of funny stuff. It's sad.
And of course there was different rules or laws in all different states.
Well, there's different laws in different states, but the federal government has been expanding its authority. Initially, it had very little authority because that's the only way the states agreed to federate. But with time and a number of very important referendums that passed, like I think it was 49, wasn't it? And they passed a Social Security referendum, which gave the Commonwealth government the power to introduce pensions in this country. Before, you relied on the state pensions. And the same with the 67 referendum, which wasn't about counting Indigenous people in the Constitution. It was about giving the federal government the authority to make legislation for Indigenous people outside the bailiwick of the state. Because before, most of the atrocious conditions which existed was due to state legislation. So when you look at the rabbit-proof fence, that wasn't federal legislation, that was West Australian legislation, and the federal government had no power to intervene, no matter how horrific that legislation was.
You know, to add to that, there's different parks in some areas that fence them off, so that protect that wildlife, for the buildings and things like that.
Yeah, most of them are private.
Which is great, you know?
They're privately owned.
So they stop